The year was 1877, and the land under Arthur Prescott's boots was dying. Or perhaps, he often thought, it had never truly been alive. It was a harsh, unforgiving stretch of Texas prairie that had promised much and given little, a place that seemed to actively resent the plow and the seed. The sun was not a nurturing force here, but a tyrant, baking the soil into a cracked, pale mockery of earth. The wind was a thief that stole the topsoil and whispered of failure in the eaves of his lonely, weathered farmhouse. Arthur had come here with a heart full of hope and a wife, Martha, whose laughter was the only thing that had ever made the dust settle. They had buried that hope alongside her and their stillborn son 3 years ago, under the lone, skeletal oak that stood sentinel on a low rise. Now, all that remained was the silence. It was a physical presence in the house, sitting in Martha's chair, lying beside him in the cold bed. His life had shrunk to a cycle of relentless, fruitless labor, a grim routine of waking before dawn, wrestling with the stubborn land, and falling into an exhausted sleep only to do it all again. He was a man hollowed out by grief, as barren as the fields he tended. He moved through his days like a ghost haunting his own life. The fences sagged, the barn door hung on a single hinge, and the well grew deeper and more reluctant with each passing month. He was 34 years old but felt ancient, worn down to the bone by a sorrow that had the weight and substance of stone. The town of redemption, a day's ride away, was a place he avoided. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the townsfolk, the pity that felt more like contempt. They saw a man who had failed, not just as a farmer, but as a husband, as a man who was supposed to protect his family from the harsh realities of this life. So he remained on his failing farm, a monument to loss, waiting for the land to finally claim him as it had everything else he loved. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow, bruised descent into nightfall, he saw them. A procession of riders cresting the hill to the west, their silhouettes stark against the blood-orange sky. They were not cowboys, nor were they the familiar sight of a traveling peddler. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed part of the landscape itself. As they drew closer, he saw they were Comanche. A shiver of primal caution, the inherited fear of a frontier settler, ran through him. He reached for the old rifle propped against the porch wall, his hand closing around the worn stock, not with aggression, but with the weary resignation of a man expecting one more hardship. There were 7 of them. The man in the lead sat tall on his horse, his face a roadmap of seasons and struggles, his long graying braids adorned with a few simple feathers. His gaze was steady, holding a kind of quiet authority that needed no announcement. Behind him, on their own mounts, were 6 women. They were of varying ages, from a girl who looked barely 16 to a woman who might have been Arthur's own age. They were dressed in beaded buckskin, their dark hair braided, their faces proud and unreadable. They did not look like a war party. They looked deliberate. They halted a respectful distance from his porch. The old man dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He approached alone, his hands open and empty, to show he meant no harm. Arthur remained on the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind and the tired creak of the porch swing. "You are Arthur Prescott," the man said. His English was measured, accented, but clear. It was a statement, not a question. Arthur gave a curt nod. "I am." "I am Mokatavato," the chief said. "These are my daughters." He gestured behind him, and the 6 women watched, their dark eyes missing nothing. "My people's lands shrink. The buffalo are gone. The world changes." He looked not at Arthur, but at the parched fields, the cracked earth. His gaze was so intense it was as if he could see through the dust into the very heart of the soil. "This land is thirsty," he said. "But it is not dead. There is water here, a hidden spring, choked by rock and neglect. My people know this land. We know its secrets." Arthur's grip tightened on the rifle. A part of him wanted to scoff, to tell the old man he knew every miserable inch of this cursed property. He had dug and sweated and bled over it. There was no secret spring. There was only dust. As if reading his thoughts, Moketavato continued. You work hard, but you work alone. Your spirit is as dry as your well. I have watched you. This admission sent another, different kind of chill through Arthur. To be observed in his private misery felt like a violation. A man alone cannot make a world, the chief stated simply. A family can. He paused, letting his words settle in the heavy air. Then came the offer, delivered with the same calm gravity as his observations about the land. I will give you a new life, Arthur Prescott. My daughters will show you the water. They will teach you what to plant and when. They know the ways of the earth that your people have forgotten. They will make this dead farm live. Arthur stared, speechless. It made no sense. Why would this man offer him such a gift? Charity was not a currency he was familiar with on this frontier. There was always a price. And in return, Arthur finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse from disuse. Moketavato's gaze was piercing. In return, you will give them sanctuary. You will share this home and the bounty it produces, and you will choose one of my daughters to be your wife. You will build a family together, a bridge between our worlds. This is my offer. The words hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. A wife. He was to choose one of these silent, watchful strangers and make her his wife. The idea was preposterous, an offense to Martha's memory, a memory he had guarded with such fierce, solitary devotion. His immediate instinct was to refuse, to send them away and retreat back into the familiar quiet of his grief. But as he looked past them, at the cracked fields and the sagging porch and the ghost of a life he was living, a desperate, traitorous sliver of something else lodged in his heart. It was not hope, not yet. It was the simple, undeniable truth of the chief's words. He was dying here, alone. He looked at the daughters. They were not objects in a transaction. They were women, watching him with an unnerving mixture of pride, apprehension, and defiance. He saw in them the same resilience the chief spoke of. He saw life, a vibrant, complicated, and terrifying life that was being offered in exchange for his solitude. The silence that followed was his own, a war between the past he could not let go of and a future he could not imagine. Moketavato stood waiting, patient as a mountain, having laid the seeds of an impossible choice in the most barren soil he could find. Arthur's refusal died on his lips. What was he protecting? A memory? An empty house? The right to fail in peace? He looked at the chief, then at the 6 women whose fates were now inexplicably tangled with his. A bitter laugh almost escaped him. The land was not the only thing that was failing. He was. And in the face of absolute ruin, even the most unthinkable offer could begin to sound like salvation. They can stay in the barn, Arthur said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth, until arrangements can be made. Moketavato nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his ancient eyes. He had not won a negotiation. He had witnessed a surrender. He spoke to his daughters in the fluid, melodic tones of their own tongue. Their expressions remained guarded, but they began to dismount, gathering their modest bundles from their horses. They moved as a unit, a constellation of sisters, their bond a palpable force in the twilight. Arthur watched them, a stranger on his own property, the architect of a bargain that he was certain would either save him or destroy him completely. The silence of his life had been shattered, and he did not yet know if the sound that replaced it was the music of creation or the tolling of a final bell. The first days were a study in silent observation. Arthur woke to the unfamiliar sounds of soft chatter from the barn, the smell of a small, contained fire where they cooked their morning meal. He went about his own chores, acutely aware of 7 pairs of eyes watching his every move. He felt clumsy, loud, his every action seeming brutish and inefficient compared to their quiet, purposeful economy of motion. They were a world unto themselves, speaking in their Comanche language, a river of sound whose meaning he could only guess at. His house, once a sanctuary of grief, now felt like a fortress under siege. He would retreat into it at night, the door a flimsy barrier against the life that was blooming just outside its walls. The daughters, for their part, kept a respectful distance, but their presence was transformative. They did not wait for his direction. On the second day, the eldest, a woman named Winona, with a serene, commanding presence, led her sisters to the spot Moketavato had described, a rocky, overgrown patch of land Arthur had always ignored. He watched from the porch, a cup of lukewarm coffee forgotten in his hand. They worked with an almost geological patience. They cleared the stubborn brush, their hands moving with practiced skill. Then, using sharpened sticks and their bare hands, they began to move rocks. It was grueling work, the kind that had broken stronger men than him. Yet, they did not complain. They worked in a seamless rhythm, their movements coordinated, their low voices a constant humming counterpoint to the grunts of their labor. The second eldest, Mesa, seemed to be the director of the work. She was quieter than Winona, her face more severe, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence. She saw things Arthur had never seen. She pointed to the subtle dip in the land, the way the hardy, deep-rooted weeds grew differently in that one area. It was she who finally found it. With a final heave, she and her sister Istus rolled away a large, flat stone. Beneath it, the earth was dark and damp. A collective sigh of satisfaction went through the group. Arthur felt a pull of disbelief and something akin to shame. He walked over, compelled to see for himself. He had walked this land 1,000 times and seen only failure. They had been here 2 days and had found its heart. Mesa looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. She gestured to the damp soil. There was no triumph in her gesture, only fact. For the next week, they dug. Arthur, moved by a reluctant sense of duty, eventually joined them. He brought his shovel and pickaxe, tools that felt crude and violent next to their methods. At first, they worked in a tense silence, the only sounds the scrape of his shovel and the thud of rocks they moved by hand. He felt their appraisal of him, their suspicion. He was the white man, the representative of the world that was erasing theirs. Slowly, a fragile truce began to form, built not on words, but on shared sweat. The youngest, a spirited girl named Neva, stumbled while carrying a heavy rock. Before he could think, Arthur lunged forward and caught her, steadying her. She looked at him with wide, startled eyes before murmuring something in her own tongue and scurrying away. But later that day, as they rested in the shade, another sister, the shy Soteo, silently offered him a strip of dried meat. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. He accepted it with a nod, the first flicker of connection in a world of silent walls. The water did not gush forth as he had imagined. It was a slow, stubborn seep, a patient welling from the deep earth, but it was there, it was real. The sisters, led by Mesa, then began the intricate work of digging narrow channels, guiding the precious moisture towards the parched fields. They worked with the precision of artists, reading the contours of the land, coaxing the water along paths it wanted to follow. He watched, humbled, as they brought life to a place where he had only managed to sow death. The bargain hung over them all, an unspoken tension. He was to choose a wife. The thought was a constant, unsettling presence. How could he choose? They were a unit, 6 distinct parts of a whole. Winona, the stoic leader. Mesa, the quiet strategist. Istus, fierce and watchful. Vivina, whose hands were always busy mending or weaving. Soteo, gentle and observant. And Neva, whose youthful energy was a bright spark in the grim landscape. To choose one felt like a violation of them all. He found himself watching Mesa the most. There was a stillness about her, a deep well of thought behind her dark eyes. She rarely spoke to him directly, but he felt her gaze on him as he worked, assessing, questioning. One evening, he found her standing by Martha's grave. The crude wooden cross he had carved was leaning, weathered by the wind. Mesa had placed a small, hardy purple wildflower at its base. She was not praying or trespassing. She was simply observing, acknowledging the grief that radiated from that small patch of earth like heat. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "That was my wife's," he said, his voice rough. "Martha." Mesa did not turn. She looked at the grave, then at the vast, empty prairie stretching beyond it. "It is a lonely place to be," she said softly, her English as careful as her father's. "She was not from here," Arthur found himself saying, the words coming unbidden. "She loved green hills and rivers that ran all year. I brought her to this." The guilt was a fresh, sharp pain. "You brought her to where your hope was," Mesa corrected him gently. "Hope is not a place. It is a seed. Sometimes it needs different soil to grow." They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them filled with the unspoken histories of their different losses. It was the first real conversation they had had, a tiny bridge built across a chasm of culture and sorrow. When he went back to the house that night, the silence within felt different. It was no longer the oppressive weight of absence, but something quieter, more contemplative. He was still alone in the house, but he was no longer alone in the world. As the weeks turned into a month, the farm began to transform. Under the sisters' care, the newly irrigated patch of land sprouted green shoots. They planted corn, squash, and beans, the three sisters, as they called them, a combination that nourished the soil as it grew. They showed him plants he had dismissed as weeds, explaining their uses for medicine or food. His barn, once a place of drafty emptiness, was now organized, tools repaired, the space shared between his meager livestock and the women's living quarters. The house, too, began to change. One day he came in from the fields to find the worn kitchen table scrubbed clean and a small pot of wildflowers, just like the one from the grave, sitting in the center. He began to eat his evening meal with them. At first it was an awkward affair. He would sit on his porch steps while they sat by their fire. Then Vivina, the quiet mender, brought him a bowl of savory stew. The next night he moved his chair closer. Soon he was sitting among them, sharing their food, listening to the rise and fall of their language, picking out a word here and there. He learned their names, their individual laughs. He saw the way Neva teased Istus and how Winona would settle their rare disputes with a single, sharp word. He was witnessing the creation of a family, and slowly, terrifyingly, realizing he was becoming a part of it. The choice of a wife remained a silent cloud on the horizon, but it was changing. It was no longer a question of which one he would take, but a dawning awareness of who he was connecting with. His conversations with Mesa grew more frequent. They spoke of the land, of the weather, of the stars. She told him the Comanche names for the constellations, stories of the coyote and the eagle. He, in turn, told her about his father's farm back in Ohio, a place of impossible greenness that felt like a dream. He found himself wanting to know her thoughts, to see the world through her wise, steady eyes. He was not falling in love in the thunderclap way he had with Martha. This was slower, quieter. Like the patient seep of the spring, they had uncovered a gradual welling of respect, admiration, and a deep, soul-shaking tenderness. He was beginning to see that the chief's offer was not just about survival, it was about finding a different kind of hope in a different kind of soil. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, creeping poison. Word of Arthur's new arrangement had reached the town of Redemption. When he rode in for supply salt, flour, coffee, the reception was colder than usual. Men who used to give him a curt nod now turned their backs. The store owner, Mr. Callahan, served him with a grimace, his eyes darting towards the door as if he were afraid of being seen with him. "Heard you got yourself some company, Prescott," Callahan muttered, counting out the change with disdain. "Living out there with a whole pack of savages." The word, savages, struck Arthur like a slap. He looked at Callahan's pinched, pale face and saw not just ignorance, but a deep, fearful prejudice. These were the same men who had offered him pity when his farm was failing. Now that it showed signs of life, tended by hands they did not understand, they offered only contempt. "They are guests on my land," Arthur said, his voice low and even, though a hot anger coiled in his gut. He scooped up his supplies and left without another word, the hostile silence of the town pressing in on his back. The rumors festered. On his next trip, he learned the talk was being stirred up by a man named Elias Vance, a rancher whose sprawling property bordered Arthur's meager farm on the east. Vance was a man who saw the world in terms of ownership and power. He had long coveted Arthur's land, not for its farming potential, but for the creek that ran along its southern edge, a vital water source he wanted to control completely. He had previously considered Arthur a non-threat, a sad case who would eventually be starved out. But now, things were different. "Vance is telling everyone you've lost your mind," a sympathetic blacksmith told Arthur in a hushed tone. "Says you've made a deal with the devil, that those Comanche women are witches who've put a spell on you. People are scared, and Vance, he knows how to use fear." The fear was a palpable thing. It manifested in small ways at first. A dead snake left on his gatepost. The word heathen scrawled in charcoal on his barn door. Arthur scrubbed it off before the sisters could see it, but the ugliness of it lingered in the air. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in him, an emotion he had not felt since Martha's death. These women had brought his world back from the brink. They had honored their end of the bargain with skill and grace. The thought of any harm coming to them because of him was intolerable. He tried to shield them from it, but they were not naive. They saw the change in his demeanor when he returned from town. They saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the horizon. One evening, as he was reinforcing the barn door, Mesa came to him. "The town," she said, "it wasn't a question. They do not like that we are here." Arthur stopped his work, his hammer hanging heavy in his hand. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face. There was no fear there, only a deep, knowing sorrow. "They are fools," he said, the word tasting inadequate. "They are men who fear what is different," she replied, her gaze steady. "My father knew this would not be easy. A bridge must have strong foundations on both sides of the river, or it will be washed away in the first storm." The storm was coming. Vance, emboldened by the town's growing hostility, escalated his campaign. He began to ride his men along the fence line, their presence a constant, silent threat. They would stop and watch the sisters work in the fields, their leering gazes a profound violation of the peace they had cultivated. Arthur confronted them once, riding out to meet them at the border of his property. "This is my land, Vance," Arthur said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your business is not here." Vance, a big man with a cruel smile and pale, cold eyes, laughed. "Your land? It looks more like a Comanche camp to me, Prescott. I'm just making sure my cattle don't wander into the wrong company." His men snickered behind him. "You best send them back where they came from, before there's trouble. Some folks are saying that land should belong to a white man who knows what to do with it." The threat was clear. This was no longer just about prejudice. It was about greed. Vance wanted the land, and he was using the sisters' presence as his excuse to take it. The confrontation left Arthur shaken but resolute. His old life of quiet desperation was over. He had been given a choice by Moketavato, and now Vance was forcing him to make another, to defend this new life, or let it be destroyed. The stakes were raised when Arthur found the narrow channel from the spring deliberately dammed with rocks and mud, choking off the vital flow of water to their fledgling crops. It was a cruel, targeted attack, aimed at the very heart of their work. He and the sisters worked for hours under the hot sun to clear the blockage, their shared anger a silent, bonding force. As they worked, he saw the fire in Istas's eyes, the grim set of Winona's jaw. They were not just victims, they were warriors in their own right, ready to defend what they had built. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit plains. The farm was no longer just a piece of property, it was a home. It was a sanctuary that he had promised Moketavato he would provide. It was the place where Misa had taught him the names of the stars. He was no longer just defending 6 women. He was defending the flicker of hope they had ignited within him. The confrontation with Vance was inevitable. The bridge Mesa had spoken of was about to face its storm, and Arthur knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not let it be washed away. He would be its foundation, strong and unyielding, no matter the cost. The sky was a sheet of pewter, threatening a rain that would not come, when Vance and his men finally rode onto Arthur's land. There were 5 of them, their horses trampling the new shoots of corn near the house, a deliberate act of destruction. They were not here to talk. They carried rifles and a swaggering confidence born of numbers and malice. Arthur had been expecting them. He stepped off the porch, his own rifle held at his side, not aiming but ready. He had told the sisters to stay in the house, to lock the door. He wanted to face this alone, to shield them from the ugliness he had invited into their lives. "Prescott," Vance called out, pulling his horse to a halt. His men fanned out behind him, a menacing crescent. "We've come to help you clean up this mess. The good people of Redemption don't want this filth so close to town." "This is my home, Elias," Arthur said, his voice carrying in the tense air. "These women are under my protection. Turn your horses around and leave." Vance laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your protection? You're one man, a broken-down farmer who couldn't even keep his own wife alive. What makes you think you can protect them?" The cruel words were meant to wound, to unman him, and they struck their mark. The old, familiar specter of his failure with Martha rose before him. But then, a new feeling, stronger and hotter, burned it away. It was the image of Mesa placing a flower on that grave, the sound of Neva's laughter, the taste of the stew Vivina had shared with him. He was not that man anymore. They had changed him. "I said leave," Arthur repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. He raised the rifle, the barrel now level with Vance's chest. For a moment, surprise flickered in Vance's cold eyes. He had expected the broken man, not this quiet pillar of defiance. He sneered, recovering his bravado. "You and what army?" He motioned to one of his men. "Burn the barn. Let's smoke these rats out." The man started to dismount, a lit torch in his hand. A wave of helpless fury washed over Arthur. He couldn't stop them all. But before the man's foot touched the ground, the front door of the house flew open. It was not a picture of cowering victims. The 6 sisters emerged, standing shoulder to shoulder on the porch. They had not hidden, they had prepared. Winona and Istas held drawn bows, arrows nocked, their aim steady and lethal. Vivina and Sotaios held heavy, sharpened farming, implements a hoe and a sickle-like weapons. Neva held a length of heavy chain. And beside them, at the forefront, stood Mesa. She held no weapon. Her hands were empty. Her power was in her gaze, which was fixed on Vance with an intensity that burned hotter than his torch. Vance and his men froze, their sneers faltering. This was not the scenario they had envisioned. They had come to terrorize a lone man and a group of helpless women. They were met with a united front, an image of unexpected, deadly strength. The man with the torch hesitated, looking to Vance for guidance. "I will not say it again," Mesa's voice rang out, clear and sharp as flint. "This is our home. You are not welcome here." The standoff was absolute. The air crackled with a tension that was about to break. It was 6 men with rifles against 1 man, 2 bows, and a wall of unbreakable will. Vance, enraged and humiliated, began to raise his own rifle, his face contorted with fury. He was going to force the issue, to spill blood to save his pride. But at that precise moment, a new sound entered the charged silence. It was the thunder of hooves, coming not from the direction of the town, but from the west, from the open prairie. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared, their forms growing larger and more distinct with each passing second. It was Moketavato, and he was not alone. Behind him were at least a dozen Comanche warriors, their faces painted for battle, their presence radiating a power that dwarfed Vance's small gang of bullies. They did not shout or charge. They simply arrived, forming a silent, imposing line behind Arthur and the sisters, a physical manifestation of the promise the chief had made. Mokotavato guided his horse forward until he was beside Arthur, his gaze falling upon Vance with the weight of an ancient judgment. Vance's face went pale. The color drained from his men's faces as they found themselves suddenly, hopelessly outnumbered, caught between a farmer who would not break, a house of women who would not bend, and a war party that had materialized from the very earth itself. "This man, Arthur Prescott, is my son," Mokotavato said, his voice calm but resonant with authority. "These women are my daughters. This land is their home. You have mistaken a bridge for a battlefield. There will be no battle here. You will leave, now." There was no room for argument. The threat was unspoken, but absolute. Vance, defeated not by violence but by a show of unshakable solidarity, sputtered for a moment, then yanked his horse's reins, turning it around in a spray of dirt. He cast one last look of pure hatred at Arthur before spurring his horse into a frantic retreat. His men scrambled to follow, their flight ignominious and total. The silence they left behind was profound. The threat had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Arthur slowly lowered his rifle, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He looked at Mesa, who was still standing on the porch, her eyes on him. In that shared gaze, everything fell into place. The bargain, the work, the fear it had all led to this moment of absolute clarity. He was no longer just a man who had accepted an offer. He was a man who had chosen a family and who had been chosen in return. He turned to Mokotavato, his heart full of a gratitude too deep for words. The old chief simply nodded, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. He had not given his daughters away. He had planted a new garden in a new land and had just witnessed its first defiant bloom. Arthur walked toward the porch, toward Mesa, his steps sure and certain for the first time in years. The choice was no longer a burden, it was a destination he had already arrived at. In the quiet aftermath, as the dust settled and Mokotavato's warriors stood as silent guardians on the perimeter of the farm, a new equilibrium was born. The violent climax had not destroyed them, it had forged them. It had burned away all remaining doubt and suspicion, leaving behind the pure, tempered steel of their bond. That evening, Arthur did not return to the lonely silence of his house. He sat with Mokotavato and the sisters around their fire, the flames casting a warm, living light on their faces. The chief's warriors kept their respectful distance, their presence a comforting assurance that the peace was real and would be protected. Later, when the chief had retired to join his men, Arthur found Mesa by the newly cleared spring. The water trickled softly, a gentle music that was the heartbeat of their revitalized land. The moon was high and bright, silvering the landscape and her dark, braided hair. "Your father," Arthur began, his voice still holding a trace of awe. "He came." "He did not need to," Mesa said, turning to face him. Her gaze was soft in the moonlight. "You were enough, we were enough, but a father's heart is a restless thing." He looked at her, at the incredible strength and grace that emanated from her. He thought of the preposterous bargain offered by her father weeks ago. It was no longer preposterous. It was the foundation of his entire world. The part of the bargain that had once terrified him the most now seemed the most natural, the most necessary thing he could imagine. "The offer your father made," Arthur said, his own heart beating a strong, steady rhythm. "It had conditions, a home, a share of the harvest, and a wife." He took a step closer, his hands finding hers. They were strong, capable hands that knew the earth, that had mended and built and fought. "That is not a condition I can meet, Mesa." A flicker of confusion, of hurt, crossed her face before he continued. "A wife is not a condition of a bargain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She is a partner, a choice of the heart. The bargain is fulfilled, the farm lives, you have your sanctuary." He paused, gathering all his courage. I am asking you, Mesa, daughter of Moketavato, not as part of any deal, but because my heart is lost without you. Will you be my wife?" A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long night. "Arthur Prescott," she said softly, her fingers tightening around his, "my heart has been waiting for you to ask." Their wedding was not a grand affair held in a church. It was a simple ceremony held under the open sky beside the life-giving spring. Moketavato officiated, his words a blend of Comanche blessings and a simple acknowledgement of the bond between two people, two cultures, two souls. Her sisters stood with her, their faces beaming, their acceptance of Arthur now complete and unconditional. They were his sisters now, too. In the months and years that followed, the farm flourished. It became an oasis of life, a testament to what could grow when different kinds of knowledge were allowed to braid together. Arthur taught them about crop rotation he learned in Ohio. They taught him about dry farming and how to live in harmony with the temperamental Texas seasons. The farmhouse, once a hollow shell of grief, filled with life and laughter. The scent of roasting corn and savory stews mingled with the familiar smell of baking bread. The quiet melody of Comanche lullabies blended with the English stories Arthur would read aloud in the evenings. Vance never troubled them again, the story of his humiliation and of the silent, formidable power that protected the Prescott farm spread throughout the county. Fear gave way to a grudging respect, and in time, even a wary curiosity. People from Redemption began to see that Arthur's farm was not a place of witchcraft, but of miraculous abundance. Arthur Prescott's life had been changed, just as the chief had promised. But it wasn't simply the offer that had done it. It was the acceptance. The acceptance of help, of a different way, of a love he never expected to find. He had started as a man drowning in the dust of his own sorrow, on a farm that was a grave for his dreams. But the arrival of a wise chief and his 6 daughters had been like a rain on parched land. They had not just saved his farm. They had taught him that home was not a place you found, but something you built. It was a garden you tended together, watering it with respect, nurturing it with kindness, and building a bridge strong enough to weather any storm, with foundations planted deep in the rich, fertile soil of the human heart. The year was 1887, and the silence of the Dakota Plains was a living thing. For Cora Donovan, it was a predator. It had stalked her for 2 winters and a summer, ever since she had buried her husband, Arthur, on the small rise behind their cabin. It was a silence that had teeth, chewing away the memories of laughter and leaving only the hollow ache of what was gone. The land itself, a vast, unforgiving expanse of dun-colored grass under a sky too wide and empty, felt less like a home and more like a tombstone for a life she had once dreamed of. Cora's days were carved into a severe and unyielding routine. She rose before the sun painted the eastern horizon in pale, watery colors. She split wood with an economy of motion that belied the searing pain in her shoulders, the axe falling with a grim, rhythmic finality. She tended her meager garden, her hands chapped and raw from the soil and the wind. She mended clothes that no one but her would ever wear again, her stitches small and tight, as if she could sew up the fraying edges of her own existence. Her world had shrunk to the 4 log walls of the cabin, the plot of turned earth, and the lonely grave marked by a simple wooden cross. Grief was not a spectre that visited in the night. It was the very air she breathed, the ground beneath her feet. It had a weight, a physical presence that bowed her spine and etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. She had been 24 when Arthur's heart had simply given out, and in the 2 years since, she felt she had aged a lifetime. The loss was twofold, a wound within a wound. First Arthur, and 6 months before him, their infant son, taken by a fever that had swept through him like a prairie fire. She rarely visited the smaller, unmarked patch of earth beside his father's grave. The silence there was the most unbearable of all. She had hardened herself to survive. Her heart, once a wellspring of easy affection, had become a fortress of ice, its walls built brick by brick from sorrow and solitude. She spoke to no one, save for the horse in the lean-to and the chickens in their coop. Her trips to the nearest settlement, a full day's ride away, were infrequent and brief. She would trade her eggs and any surplus vegetables for flour, salt, and coffee, her words clipped and functional, her eyes avoiding the gazes of others. They saw a grim-faced widow, too young to be so broken, and whispered their pity or their judgment when she turned her back. She felt their stares like brands on her skin, but refused to give them the satisfaction of her tears. One afternoon in late autumn, the sky turned the color of a deep bruise. A wind rose from the north, howling like a thing grieving, carrying the first sharp bite of the coming winter. It rattled the single glass pane in her window and moaned in the eaves of the cabin. Cora was inside, stoking the fire in the stone hearth, when a sound, distinct from the wail of the wind, made her freeze. It was a faint rhythmic thudding against her door. Her first thought was of a wolf, or perhaps a dying buffalo, but the sound was too deliberate. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, coiled in her stomach. No one came to her door. No one ever came. She took the heavy iron poker from its stand beside the fire, its weight a small comfort in her hand. Her knuckles were white as she gripped it. The thudding stopped, replaced by a soft, scraping sound, and then silence. Only the wind answered. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest, for what felt like an eternity. The silence from outside was now more menacing than the noise had been. Steeling herself, she moved to the door, her steps soundless on the worn floorboards. She lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured it and pulled it inward just a crack. Toes the wind tore at the opening, trying to shove its way inside. Through the sliver of grey light, she saw nothing at first. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it. A small shape huddled on her porch, half covered by a dusting of the first snow. It was a child, an Indian child. He was lying on his side, his small body curled against the cold. He wore buckskin leggings and a thin tunic, wholly inadequate for the sudden, vicious turn in the weather. His face, turned toward the door, was flushed with an unnatural heat, his black hair matted to his forehead with sweat despite the freezing air. As she watched, a tremor ran through his small frame. Cora's mind raced, a torrent of fear and prejudice warring with a deeply buried instinct. She knew the stories. She had heard the talk in town about the Lakota, their lands shrinking, their people starving, their resentment a simmering pot threatening to boil over. To take him in was to invite trouble she could not possibly handle. They would come looking for him. They would see her, a lone white woman, and assume the worst. They might burn her cabin, or worse. The safe thing, the sensible thing, was to close the door, bar it, and pretend she had seen nothing. But the boy moaned, a thin, desolate sound that cut through the howl of the wind and pierced the icy walls of her heart. His eyes, dark and glassy with fever, fluttered open for a moment, but they were unseeing. He was so small, smaller even than she remembered her own son being, though he was clearly older. The sight of his suffering, so naked and absolute, overrode everything else. It was a sight she knew too well. With a strangled sob that was more anger than sorrow, she swung the door wide. "Damn it all," she whispered to the wind, to God, to the ghost of her husband. She set the poker down, bent, and scooped the boy into her arms. He was lighter than he looked, a fragile bundle of burning heat and shivering limbs. She carried him inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and the silence of her cabin was broken. She laid him on the braided rug before the fire, the warmest place in the cabin. Her hands trembled as she untied the leather thongs of his tunic. His skin was dry and scorching to the touch. On his chest and arms, she saw them, the faint, rose-colored spots that she recognized with a sickening lurch of her stomach. She had seen them once before in the settlement, on a child who had not lived to see the next spring. Smallpox, the Red Plague. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. This was not just a fever, this was a death sentence, for him and likely for her. She backed away from the boy, her hand flying to her mouth. Her carefully constructed solitude was not just a defense against sorrow, it was a defense against this very thing, against the chaos and disease of the world outside her door, and she had just invited it in. She looked at the boy, his breathing shallow and rapid, and then at her own hands, the hands that had touched him. It was too late. A wave of fatalistic calm washed over her. What did it matter? Her life was already a ghost of what it should have been. If she was to die, what difference did it make if it was from loneliness or from this? But the boy was still fighting. She spent the next hour in a flurry of purposeful activity, the old, forgotten instincts of a caregiver taking over. She moved her own narrow cot from the corner and placed it beside the hearth. Gently, she lifted the boy onto it. She filled a basin with cool water from the barrel and found a clean linen cloth. For 7 days and 7 nights, that small cabin became a battleground. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roaring fire, the moaning wind, and the child's ragged breaths. His name, she learned in a fleeting moment of lucidity on the 3rd day, was Wapasha. He had whispered it, his voice a dry rasp, his eyes briefly clearing to reveal a flicker of awareness, of fear. Wapasha, she had repeated softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. You are safe, Wapasha. You rest now. She did not know if he understood her words, but the terror in his eyes seemed to recede, replaced by a weary resignation. The first few days were a blur of thankless, terrifying work. She bathed his burning body, trying to bring the fever down. She coaxed spoonfuls of broth and water between his cracked lips, most of which dribbled back out. The rash bloomed, turning from spots to raised pustules, and the foul odor of the sickness filled the small space. She did not flinch. She cleaned him, changed the bedding, and kept the fire roaring, fighting the encroaching chill that seemed to emanate from the disease itself. In the long dark hours of the night, when the boy's delirium was at its worst, she found herself talking to him. The words, dammed up for 2 years, began to flow in a trickle, then a stream. She told him about Arthur, about his strong hands and his quiet smile. She told him about their journey west, filled with hope that now seemed like a cruel joke. And then, hesitantly, she spoke of the one she never spoke of. I had a son too, she murmured, her voice catching as she sponged Wapasha's brow. His name was Thomas. He had hair as fine as corn silk. He didn't stay long. The admission hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was the first time she had said his name aloud since the day she had wrapped him in his christening gown and laid him in the cold earth. Tending to Wapasha became a penance and a prayer. Every cloth she dipped, every spoonful of water she offered, was an act of atonement for the child she could not save. She saw Thomas's face in the sleeping boy's features, felt the memory of his small, warm body in the weight of Wapasha in her arms. The ice around her heart began to crack. She was no longer just a widow surviving. She was a woman fighting for a life, not her own, but his. It was a purpose, sharp and clear and agonizing. She stopped thinking about the danger to herself. His survival was the only thing that mattered. On the morning of the 7th day, she awoke slumped in the chair beside the cot, her neck stiff, her body aching with a profound exhaustion. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. A leaden dread filled her. She looked at the boy. He was still, his chest not moving. No, she breathed, scrambling to her feet. She leaned over him, her ear close to his mouth. Nothing. Then she saw it, a faint, fluttering rise and fall of his chest. His breathing was no longer ragged and shallow, but deep and even. She touched his forehead. The fire was gone. His skin was cool, damp with a healthy sweat. The fever had broken. A wave of relief so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her. She sank back into the chair, tears finally streaming down her face, not tears of grief, but of a fierce, exhausted triumph. He would live. The pustules had begun to dry, and though he would be scarred, he would live. She watched him sleep for a long time, a real, healing sleep. As the sun climbed higher, a deep chill settled into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A tremor started in her hands. She tried to stand, to add another log to the fire, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her head swam, and the edges of the room blurred. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute, what was happening. The disease, having been vanquished from the boy's body, had found a new home in hers. The next few hours passed in a haze of rising fever. She managed to drag herself to her own bed in the far corner of the cabin, pulling the quilts over her shaking body. The world began to distort. The familiar log walls seemed to ripple and sway. The fire in the hearth roared like a dragon. She was thirsty, so thirsty, but she couldn't move. Some time later, she was vaguely aware of movement. Wapasha was awake. He had pushed himself up on the cot, his dark eyes, now clear and intelligent, fixed on her. He looked small and frail, a ghost of a child, but he was alive. He saw her shivering, heard the moan that escaped her lips. Fear returned to his face, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was for her. He slid off the cot, his legs unsteady. He stumbled to the water barrel, filled a dipper with shaking hands, and brought it to her. She tried to drink, but her teeth chattered against the metal rim, and the water spilled down her chin. He watched her, his expression a mixture of childish helplessness and a solemn understanding far beyond his years. He knew this sickness. He knew what it did. He knew she had taken it from him. He touched her hand, a small, cool pressure on her burning skin. He said something in his own language, the words soft and liquid. Then, with a resolve that seemed to fill his small frame, he turned and went to the door. He paused for a moment, looking back at her, his dark eyes promising a return. Then he slipped out into the vast, snowy world, leaving her to the mercy of the fever. Cora drifted. Time lost all meaning, stretching and compressing in a delirious tide. She was tossed on waves of heat and cold, haunted by fragmented dreams. She saw Arthur's face, then Thomas's, then the solemn eyes of the Lakota boy. Sometimes she was burning in a desert, other times she was freezing in a blizzard. She was dimly aware of her own mortality, of her body failing. She had saved the boy, and it had cost her everything. There was a strange peace in the thought. She had not died of loneliness after all. She had died for a reason. She let go, sinking into the darkness, the roar of the fever, a final, consuming fire. She floated back to consciousness slowly, as if from a great depth. The first thing she registered was sound, a low, rhythmic sound, like a deep heartbeat. It was a drum. The second was smell. Not the foulness of sickness, but the clean, sharp scent of sage and something else, something earthy and unknown. The third was presence. The cabin was full. Her eyelids felt as if they were weighted with stones. With a monumental effort, she forced them open. The light in the cabin was dim, filtered. The fire was banked low. And surrounding her bed, standing in a silent, solemn circle, were people. They were Lakota. Warriors and old men, their faces etched with the deep lines of hardship and wisdom. They were tall and imposing, their presence filling every inch of the small room, yet they were utterly still. There were 12 of them. They were not looking at her with malice or anger. Their gazes were intense, focused, imbued with a profound gravity. She saw Wapasha standing near the foot of the bed, nestled beside a tall, powerfully built man whose face was a mask of stoic grief and gratitude. The man's eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw the boy's same dark, intelligent gaze. This was his father. Fear tried to surface, but she was too weak to sustain it. This was not a raiding party. This was something else entirely. The man, who she would later know as Chayton, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. At this signal, the men began to chant. It was not a sound of war, but a sound of power. It was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very bones of the cabin. It rose and fell in cadence with the single, steady drum beat. It was a sound as old as the plains, a language of the earth itself. They were not speaking to her, but for her. They were holding a vigil. The hours, or perhaps days, that followed were a waking dream. The 12 healers of Chaitan's band, their greatest spiritual authorities, had come. They had followed the small, desperate tracks of a boy who had walked for a day and a night to bring them back. They had found the woman who had traded her life for his, and they had decided to intervene. It was a debt that must be honored. They worked in shifts. One would burn herbs in an abalone shell, wafting the fragrant smoke over her with an eagle feather. Another would touch her forehead, her chest, her hands, murmuring prayers in their soft, guttural tongue. They brewed teas from roots and leaves they had brought with them, concoctions that were bitter and strange, and gently lifted her head to help her drink. Wapasha, his strength slowly returning, would sit by her side, his small hand often resting on her arm, a constant, anchoring presence. Cora drifted between consciousness and the fevered lands of her mind. In her lucid moments, she watched them. She saw the intricate beadwork on their shirts, the feathers tied in their long, graying hair. She saw the deep concentration on their faces, the absolute focus they brought to their task. There was no judgment in their eyes for the color of her skin, for the world she represented. In this small, sacred space, she was not a white settler, an outsider, an enemy. She was a life, balanced on a knife's edge, and they were the collective will pushing her back toward the side of the living. Chaitan rarely left the cabin. He stood like a sentinel, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. One evening, when the fever had lessened its grip and she could keep her eyes open for more than a few minutes, he came and sat on the stool beside her bed. "He is my son," Chaitan said, his voice a low rumble. His English was clear, learned from traders and treaties. "My only son." He did not need to say more. In that simple statement, Cora heard the echo of her own loss, the chasm that had opened in her own life. "He is a good boy," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Chaitan nodded, a deep and solemn movement of his head. "You have a strong heart," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, an observation made by a man who knew the nature of spirits. "You fought the sickness for him. Now we fight it for you." The sickness raged, but it met a wall of resistance it could not breach. It was not just the herbal remedies and the cool cloths. It was the unyielding presence of the 12 men, the ceaseless rhythm of the drum, the power of the ancient chants that filled the cabin and seemed to fortify its very walls against the intrusion of death. They were weaving a shield of communal energy, of spiritual force, around her. They were giving her their strength. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to mend. The fire in her blood cooled to embers, then to ash. The delirium receded, leaving behind a profound weakness, but a clear mind. The day came when she awoke, and the air was clean, the only scent that of the wood smoke from the hearth. The chanting had stopped. The cabin was empty, save for two. Chaitan sat in the chair, watching her. Wapasha was asleep on his rug by the fire, his small body finally relaxed in deep, untroubled rest. Cora pushed herself up on her elbows. The world held steady. The weakness was there, a great, heavy blanket, but the sickness was gone. Chaitan saw her move and stood. He came to the bed and looked down at her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, the stern lines of his expression softened, just slightly. "The spirit has chosen to stay with you," he said. She looked around the quiet cabin. It felt larger, hollowed out by the absence of the others. "They're gone?" "Their work is done," he answered. He gestured to the small table beside her bed. There was a pouch of cured meat, a bundle of dried herbs, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. "We do not forget adept." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a kind she had never known before. They were not for sorrow or relief, but for a grace so profound and unexpected it left her speechless. She who had walled herself off from the world had been saved by the very people she had been taught to fear. She, who believed she was utterly alone, had been surrounded by a community that had claimed her as one of their own to protect. Chaitan called to his son. Wapasha woke and came to stand beside his father, looking at Cora with shy reverence. He reached out and touched her hand, the one that had held the dipper of water for him. His skin was smooth and cool. "Thank you," he said, the English words careful and practiced. Cora squeezed his hand, a strength she didn't know she possessed flowing into her arm. "And you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Wapasha." They left soon after. She watched from the doorway, wrapped in a quilt, as the tall warrior and the small boy walked away across the snow-covered plains, their figures shrinking against the vast white canvas of the land until they were gone. The silence that returned to the cabin was different. It was no longer a predator. It was a space for reflection, filled with the resonant echo of the drumbeat, the memory of the chants. The grief for Arthur and Thomas was still there, a part of her soul's landscape, but it was no longer the only feature. Beside it, something new had been planted, a strange and resilient seed of hope. In the weeks that followed, as her strength returned, she found that she was not truly alone. Every few days, a package would be left on her porch: a brace of rabbits, a skin of fresh water, a bundle of firewood already cut. She never saw who left them, but she knew. It was a quiet, continued watchfulness, a thread of connection that stretched across the empty plains. The land no longer seemed like a tombstone. When she looked out her window, she saw not an empty void, but the horizon where her saviors had disappeared. The wind no longer howled with grief. It carried the faint, imagined sound of a drum, a reminder that resilience was not just about enduring alone, but about the unexpected, unasked for kindness that can bridge any divide. Her heart, once a fortress of ice, had been melted by a fire, not of sickness, but of a grace she would carry with her for the rest of her days. She had opened her door to a dying child and, in doing so, had found her own way back to the world of the living.